Imagine living in a world where bathing was a luxury and the smell of sweat, smoke, and unwashed clothes clung to you like a second skin. During World War II, women across Europe and beyond were forced into lives that tested their dignity in ways few of us could ever imagine. While the headlines told of bombs, armies, and battles, behind closed doors another war was unfolding, a war against dirt, odor, and the collapse of everyday hygiene. Women became silent soldiers in this hidden battle, making do with almost nothing, trying to hold onto a shred of normal life while the world around them burned. Soap, something we take for granted today, was the first casualty. It wasn't just scarce, it became a black market treasure. Soldiers were prioritized, and civilians, especially women at home, were left scrambling. Many were forced to create their own crude substitutes out of ashes, fat, and lye. These homemade soaps often burned the skin or left an oily residue that clung even tighter to the body. Washing with these concoctions sometimes made women feel dirtier, not cleaner. Others simply gave up and learned to live without soap, wiping themselves with cold cloths and hoping to remove at least a little of the sweat and grime. Bathing itself became nearly impossible in bomb cities where water supplies were damaged or rationed. Women queued for buckets of cold water, sometimes sharing the same tub with several family members, each one using the same dirty water until it resembled a swamp. A bath might mean a quick splash of cold water over the face and armpits once a week. Many went even longer. The smell of bodies that hadn't seen soap in months filled basements and air raid shelters. Eyewitnesses described the stench as suffocating. Urine, menstrual blood, sweat, and smoke mingling in the air with no escape. One survivor later admitted that the shelter often smelled worse than the rubble-strewn streets above. Hair became another battlefield. Shampoo vanished, and women were forced to improvise with vinegar, beer, or even rinses of stale urine to strip grease from their hair. These substitutes worked poorly and left behind their own pungent odors. In desperation, many shaved their heads entirely, not only to rid themselves of lice, but because washing long hair was out of the question. Others tied their hair in scarves or rags, hiding the oily strands underneath. Women working long shifts in munitions factories had no time or means to clean their hair, so it stiffened with sweat and soot until it looked more like rope than hair. Clothes presented a humiliating problem. Laundry soap was as rare as gold, so women washed their dresses and underwear infrequently, sometimes only once every couple of weeks. In many households, one set of underwear had to last through days of hard labor before it saw water. The fabric stiffened with layers of sweat, dust, and natural oils until it practically stood on its own. The lack of clean clothing brought infestations of lice and fleas. Women scratched themselves raw, leaving sores that became infected. In rural areas, washing clothes meant dunking them into icy rivers with no detergent, scrubbing with rocks, and hoping that at least the surface dirt would come off. Many garments simply never felt truly clean again. Makeup and grooming, once symbols of femininity, became compromised acts of desperation. With water scarce, women often applied powder and lipstick in the morning and left it on for days, unable to wash it away at night. The powder mixed with sweat and dirt, forming a grimy mask that clung to their skin. Razors were difficult to find, leaving many women to abandon shaving altogether. Deodorant was almost unknown, so women dabbed perfume on their armpits or necks in the hope that fragrance could overpower body odor. It never fully did, and the clash of sweat and perfume created its own pungent cocktail. Perfume became less about beauty and more about survival, a shield against the humiliation of one's own smell. Public spaces magnified the suffering. Trains, trams, and buses were crowded with women who had not bathed in weeks, wearing clothes unwashed for just as long. In air raid shelters, packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, the collective odor was unforgettable. Children cried not only from fear of bombs, but from the stinging, sour air of hundreds of unwashed bodies. Some people avoided sitting too close to others, knowing the smell would cling to them afterward. Soldiers returning from the front lines were shocked to find that their homes sometimes smelled worse than the trenches. The private shame of women mixed with the collective despair of war-torn cities. Yet hygiene was not only about outer appearance, it struck deeply into private, intimate matters. Women's monthly struggles became ordeals of misery. With sanitary pads and tampons almost impossible to find, women cut up old curtains, scraps of clothing, or even ripped strips from bed sheets to use as makeshift pads. These rags were washed when possible, but with no soap and little water, they were often reused still stained, spreading infections and odors. Some women carried the bloodied cloths in their pockets until they could find a discreet moment to rinse them, often in cold, filthy water. The shame and discomfort were unrelenting. In shelters or workplaces, women sat for hours in garments that were damp, smelly, and humiliating, yet there was no alternative. As the war dragged on, dignity eroded day by day. The lack of soap, the stink of sweat, the greasy hair, the lice, the filthy underwear, these became normal parts of women's lives. To endure them was a quiet form of resilience. Women did not always speak openly of these struggles, yet they carried them with stoic determination, holding families together while silently bearing the indignity of constant filth. In a world where survival was uncertain and bombs could fall at any moment, hygiene was often the first sacrifice, but it was also one of the heaviest burdens. This hidden war of dirt and odor was a daily reminder that even when the guns were silent, women were still fighting. Not on battlefields, but in their kitchens, in their shelters, and in their own bodies. It was a fight against humiliation, against decay, and against the loss of humanity itself. And just when you think life couldn't get more unbearable, the truth of women's most intimate hygiene struggles reveals how deep this war reached into every private corner of their existence. Menstrual hygiene during the war was one of the most humiliating struggles women endured. With sanitary pads and tampons scarce, women had to improvise with whatever scraps of fabric they could find, old sheets, rags, even curtains torn apart. These makeshift pads were reused until they disintegrated, washed poorly in cold water without soap, then dried in secret corners to avoid embarrassment. The process was unhygienic, spreading infections and odors that became impossible to mask. For many, the shame of carrying blood-soaked rags in their pockets until they could wash them was almost worse than the discomfort itself. In bomb shelters, women sat in damp clothing for hours, unable to change, forced to endure the stares of others who knew exactly what they were going through. The monthly cycle became a monthly humiliation, another private war layered on top of the public one. Underwear shortages added to the misery. Some women owned only 1 or 2 pairs, worn until the fabric weakened and holes appeared. They patched them repeatedly, sewing scraps into the thinning cloth, stretching their life far beyond comfort. Others abandoned underwear altogether, not out of choice but because there simply wasn't any. For poorer women, underwear became a luxury, while wealthier women who had the means sometimes purchased it from the black market. But for the majority, it was normal to live for weeks with the same undergarments, carrying the smell and discomfort with no way out. The lack of proper washing and clean clothing meant lice, fleas, and bedbugs became constant companions. They nested in seams of dresses, in hair, in bedsheets that had not been washed for months. Women spent nights scratching until their skin bled, waking with sores and scabs. Infected bites spread quickly in crowded shelters, where lice jumped from person to person. Chemical solutions like DDT were sometimes distributed, but they burned the skin, destroyed fabrics, and were far from safe. Some women shaved their heads to battle lice, while others resorted to sprinkling vinegar or kerosene on their clothes, enduring the sting of the liquid just to kill the bugs. Soldiers brought lice home from the front, passing them to their wives and children, ensuring infestations never truly ended. Women serving in uniform faced struggles that were even harsher. Nurses on the front lines often went weeks without bathing, their hair matted beneath caps, uniforms soaked with sweat and blood. Sanitary supplies were even rarer in battle zones, forcing them to use bandages as menstrual cloths, discarding them only when absolutely necessary. The constant smell of unwashed bodies, combined with the blood of patients, created an atmosphere that no amount of perfume could mask. For women in auxiliary roles, drivers, messengers, factory workers, the situation was no better. Long shifts left them drenched in perspiration with no chance to change clothes. The smell followed them everywhere, a constant reminder of the conditions they were trapped in. Pregnant women suffered, especially. With hospitals bombed and resources scarce, childbirth was often handled in filthy conditions with little more than rags and unwashed hands. Midwives reused tools, sometimes without cleaning them, spreading infections that were often fatal. Women gave birth in cellars, in shelters, even in ruins, surrounded by dirt and rats. Without soap or sterile supplies, childbirth became a gamble and maternal death rates soared. Those who survived faced recovery in unhygienic environments, lying in beds soaked with sweat and blood, with little more than cold water to clean themselves. Teeth and oral care were yet another neglected corner of life. Toothpaste was rationed to the point of disappearance, so women brushed with salt, baking soda, or even ground charcoal. These harsh substitutes wore away enamel, leaving teeth brittle and yellow. Many shared a single toothbrush among entire families. Cavities and tooth loss were common, and foul breath became widespread. Dentists were unavailable for ordinary women, who endured the pain of rotting teeth because there was no choice. The loss of oral health made women self-conscious, but survival mattered more than appearance. To cope with the stench of unwashed bodies, women turned to creative methods. Perfume was used as armor, dabbed on armpits, necks, or even undergarments to disguise odor. For those without perfume, herbs like lavender or mint leaves were stuffed into pockets and bras, offering a fleeting freshness. Some smoked cigarettes constantly, using the pungent smell of tobacco to cover worse scents. Cigarette smoke became a strange kind of deodorant, clinging to hair and clothes, a smell many preferred to the stench of sweat. Yet no matter how much they tried, the smell never truly went away. The psychological toll of these conditions was crushing. Women felt stripped of dignity, ashamed of their bodies, and embarrassed by odors they could not control. Some admitted that the lack of hygiene was more humiliating than hunger. Relationships strained as returning husbands struggled to recognize the wives they had left behind, now worn, exhausted, and unable to keep up even the most basic standards of cleanliness. Young women worried about losing their femininity, about no longer being seen as attractive, while older women resigned themselves to living in constant discomfort. Class differences only deepened these struggles. Wealthier women sometimes had access to soap, extra underwear, and perfume through black markets or hidden supplies. They managed to keep some semblance of cleanliness, while poor women endured the filthiest conditions. The stench of poverty became a mark of shame, dividing women even as they faced the same war. Yet in many communities, suffering became a shared experience. Neighbors exchanged jokes about their war perfume of sweat and smoke, laughing at their misfortune to ease the shame. Humor became a weapon, a way to survive in dignity without breaking. Despite everything, women carried on. They cooked, worked in factories, raised children, and supported soldiers, all while silently enduring the torment of filth. The sacrifices they made were not glamorous, but they were vital. Every woman who stood in line for water, who scrubbed her only dress in a freezing river, who endured lice and bloodied rags, was fighting her own war. Not with guns or tanks, but with resilience, endurance, and quiet strength. Looking back today, it is almost impossible to imagine the daily reality they endured. We complain if deodorant runs out, if toothpaste tastes strange, if we skip one shower. Yet for millions of women during World War II, weeks without bathing, months without proper sanitary care, and years without dignity were normal life. Their struggle reminds us that war does not only destroy cities and armies, it invades the most private, intimate spaces of existence. The battlefield may have decided the fate of nations, but the hidden war of hygiene shaped the lives of millions of women in ways history books rarely describe. They fought a war against filth, against shame, and against the loss of humanity itself. And though their suffering often went unspoken, it was no less heroic.